Okay, that fixed it. Welcome, everybody. I hope that you are having a great day and that it is beautiful. It is an absolutely beautiful day in Nashville, Tennessee, and everybody is kind of in Stanley Cup Predators fervor. And I have been asked repeatedly if I can end class early, so we will just see about that. Maybe we'll have very short office hours. So the class time today is scheduled from 5:30 to 7 as reflected in the syllabus, and then we will have office hours from 7 to 7:30 if you all need that and there's anybody who wants to just kind of hang out and ask questions and all that good stuff. I know that a lot of students in person catch me after class, and there's lots of good discussion sometimes, so I would love to extend that opportunity for you all. But as I mentioned, if not, we will all just go on our merry way. So the plan for today is I just want to start with any kind of housekeeping things, see if there's any sort of niggling questions about Canvas, accessing information, getting announcements, anything like that. And then we'll go and do a lecture for about 50 minutes or so, maybe an hour, depending on how it goes. And then we will jump into around 6:30 around our individual group presentations, or a little before then. I'm very, very excited. This afternoon's presentations were phenomenal. And as I mentioned, our online students are some of our best. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentations. Okay, so we'll start. That's our evening. So we'll start with any questions. Feel free to turn your mute button off. If you are not talking, if you could hit mute, that would be awesome. Otherwise, be on mute, or you can use the chat function if you just have any questions. You all should have the quiz posted by now. I know a couple of you have already taken it and done very well, so that's good. The quizzes will be in the same place every single week under that quiz instructions and links to quizzes. There's actually a module now, so you can access it from 2 different places. So that should be running. I will try to have the quizzes up before Thursday. I know some of you like to take them before class, but I am in the process of updating them and getting them all shifted over to Canvas, and so it's taking some extra time. And so at the very latest, they'll be posted on kind of Thursday each week, so you can expect that. But again, I'll try to get those up earlier. I have also today posted the Unit 3, the stress and trauma. So if you guys are kind of wanting to get a little preview of that, that's available now as well. Are there any questions, any trouble with video links or anything like that? Everybody's happy as a clam?
I just had a quick question.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of my classmates can agree with me, and I'm sure you will too. A lot of the reading, there's just a ton. And so I know that you were pointing us towards the vocab and those specific things to kind of help us, but I'm wondering if you had any advice on how to trim down the essentials and really, so that when I do take the quiz, I know that I'm studying those parts specifically. Mm-hmm. Is there any advice you could give on how to narrow where to go?
Yes, great question. So what I would say to that is, first and foremost, I will reiterate, as I mentioned in the class last week, that this first quiz, because this is such new information for pretty much all of you, or almost all of you, I have really kept the quiz very, very basic. It is a very simple quiz. It is focused primarily on vocabulary, and then where it is about a specific reading, it's very, very general from the reading. So it's going to, again, I don't want to be tricky or make things overly difficult or complicated. So it'll be if it's about a reading, 2 things. Number one is it will actually say in the quiz question, according to so-and-so 2013. So automatically it's going to direct you to that article. So you can kind of put everything else aside and know that it's going to be from that article. And number two, it will be a central theme from that article. I will try not to nitpick and go away and find some really obscure thing. So I think that this quiz, and especially I can tell from the folks who have already taken it, I think that everybody can, if you've done the readings, if you've developed a vocabulary list and you've got your list in front of you, and you've looked at the lectures and watched all the videos, I expect you to do very, very well on this first quiz. I have purposefully kept it very simple, and honestly, it's a pretty easy quiz. That's the feedback that I get, and that's what people's grades tend to show. If you do not do well on this quiz for some reason, please reach out to me. I'll try to keep an eye on things, and I might reach out to you. But if you're really feeling stuck, or you're like, I did everything that you asked and I'm still not doing well, please, let's have a little one-on-one. Doesn't have to be for too long. And let's just see if we can't get you kind of prepped, see what kind of brainstorm what some of the issues were. So I think that's the best I can do in answering your question. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it does. There's just a lot of underlying themes that came up, especially in the videos. Some of the speakers had really good points. And so my brain would start wondering, well, what about this? And how does this connect to the other readings? And then I was thinking about the CTE. So my brain was trying to like somehow maneuver all of that. And so I was like, I really have no idea which direction the quiz is going to go. But yes, that really helps me a lot.
Yeah, Alicia, that's a great question. So in terms of synthesizing all of that, which is kind of that whole kind of coming together, so you're pulling this reading and this video and this, the CTE is really the place where I expect you all to do that, which is why it's so important that you're really focusing on that focusing on that each week, because I promise you, if you really spend some time on that CTE, you will learn this material. And in doing so, you will be prepared for the quiz. The quiz is in many ways, I'm not in love with this. It's not my happy face, but it's kind of perfunctory, just simply by the very nature that I teach all 4 sections of this course, and I have 84 beautiful souls with me this summer, and I just can't grade those individual CTEs. So the quiz is it's not going to be asking you to be kind of pulling and synthesizing. Like, for example, at least in the first few, I'm trying to get there and trying to kind of update my questions and things like that. But for the first few, you can expect it to be primarily on the vocabulary. It'll be like, blank is blank. It's just going to be really straightforward and not overly complicated. But the third and fourth quizzes will be a little harder. So, great question. Are there any other questions about anything in general or accessing info?
Yeah, I had one question about the Ghost in Your Genes video. I had some trouble watching that. I don't know if that happened to other people.
Oh, no.
But I was able to find it on YouTube, so It wasn't an issue, but I couldn't access it through the link on Canvas.
Yikes. If anybody has any problem, this goes for this one and in the future, please, as soon as you find that, please email me and I will double check it. I'll probably most of the time, especially for that particular link, send you to OIT because it may actually be an issue on your end. So somebody, Candace, you had to watch it on Firefox. So this semester, I use that video all the time. It's one of my favorite ones. And this semester is the first time that I have been able to access the full original NOVA documentary and been able through our library system. And so this is actually the first time I've published that link. So I was a little bit concerned about folks accessing it, but from what they told me, it's like you just have to log into the system. So for some reason you're not logged into UT somehow, maybe that's the problem. So I would say contact OIT. The version or versions that they have on Vimeo or YouTube are pretty much it. They're not, some of the visibility is a little off. I showed one time I had it where it was like lightning bolts just in the background. I don't know if y'all saw that one. So I was really trying to get away from those sort of weird versions. Some of them were cut off or in pieces, and So I was having some issues with those. So I was excited to be able to offer it through the UT system, but sounds like some of y'all, it didn't work. So if you have that issue, please email me as soon as you find it. I'll do some digging, see if it's an issue, and then may have to forward you on to OIT. Ellen, I'm so glad to hear that OIT was helpful. If any of y'all are intimidated for calling OIT, I'm not kidding when I tell you I have them on speed dial. I deal with them all the time. They are absolutely fabulous. This is not your typical kind of OIT situation. They're extraordinarily organized, and they are very, very helpful. So don't be afraid while you're for this class or any other classes. They really are helpful. Also, if you have problems with your quiz, if your quiz times out or something weird happens when you're taking it, call OIT, get that record of the technological issue, and then email me and I can reset your quiz. Yes, that is the issue. It does require a specific plugin. So for any, if you didn't download that Silverlight plugin, then you're probably going to not be able to access it. So I'm glad you were able to find it on YouTube. But in the future, all the UT library videos, I think, require that Silverlight plugin. So that may be it too. Okay, I'm glad you were able to find it though, because that was a big one. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one question. I was just wondering if I got most of my vocabulary from the 2 lectures. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The vocabulary is a little bit of a catch-all of some you're going to have to find on your own. Some will be in the readings. Some will be in the lectures. Some kind of from the videos, or at least reinforcements or different angles of certain concepts. But anything that's not kind of evident from the readings or the lectures or the primary places, you will have to find on your own. Sometimes, like when I post those things like brain facts or the genetics tutorial, where it's like a website that just has hordes of information, sometimes the vocab will be buried in there and you kind of have to
okay.
But there's nothing wrong with, Googling stuff. Just stay away from Wikipedia.
Gotcha.
Good question. Anything else? Okay. Well, we will go ahead and jump into the lecture. Hopefully you all saw, I posted I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I posted a new lecture that is pretty much a kind of regurgitation of the of kind of the other lectures. I just sort of was trying to streamline just because we don't have a lot of time, and some of those other long slide decks just take forever. And so I wanted to kind of jump in to a conversation just looking at kind of why the nature-nurture debate is, so 20th century and is just not really relevant to us. And it's not that it's not relevant, it's just the conversation has changed. And I think that you all have picked up on that and from all the videos and all the readings. So before I kind of jump in here, I'm curious, why do you think, based on your readings, what is your take on why, as social workers, we are so, why we're even talking about epigenetics? Like, what do you think that's about? Who wants to jump in there?
Well, I think as social workers, we've always been, like, our big thing is the environment and, like, how it affects our clients, not only on a micro level with family, but in a macro level when it comes to, like, systems. And so I feel like epigenetics is our way of kind of pointing towards we have, like, scientific proof that the environment really does affect our biology, and I think it's just so important, not only because it backs up the work we've been doing, but it gives us more grounds to expand on the work that we do with our clients. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. That is, very well said. You know, one of the things that, especially when we kind of get into that looking at this kind of from a nature versus nurture discussion, sometimes people want to sort of throw out all of those prior developmental theorists that you, I'm sure, as advanced standing students are very familiar with from your undergrad days. You know, Erickson, Piaget, those, you know, Bowlby, those. It's the conversations that we're having now in this class, the concepts that we're covering, they actually serve to reinforce those theorists in many cases, and as Alex said, show that that proof that you know, it just serves to reinforce from a more science kind of hard science standpoint, reinforces a lot of those prior theorists. So it's kind of like they actually go hand in hand, so we can still learn a lot from those different developmental stages, and certainly attachment is huge. It's just now we actually understand how attachment works in looking at the brain. We understand it from a neurophysiological standpoint, and so it's sort of like we understand it from two different angles now, where before we were just looking at it through observation. Now we can actually do things like brain scans and dissect people's brains, and do you know, all kinds of different you know, EEGs, and you know, look at it from a much different, much more physiological basis. So I just wanted to, I don't think I mentioned that last week, and I wanted to make sure that I touched on that. So so yes, Alex is right. You know, we really do look at this person and environment. That's what social workers do. We focus on social justice. We are absolutely designed and trained to serve vulnerable populations, and many vulnerable populations are vulnerable because of their environments. And epigenetics helps us to kind of marry these two concepts of, you know, what is the role of genetics in people's human behavior, and then how does environment actually serve to affect those genetics and how those genes are expressed. So you all know we serve folks across many, many different populations, and anytime, and you all know this, but I'll just reiterate it, anytime that you are serving a client, working on an intervention, working at an agency, you know, whatever setting that you all are in, there is some policy that is supporting that, whether that's funding, whether that's kind of program related, political, some kind of legislative policy. There are every single thing that we do is impacted by policy. So when there's two pieces, or there's multiple layers of this, the importance of why we're talking about epigenetics is because as the science evolves, our interventions are going to evolve. And as our interventions evolve, like think about the advances that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is around trauma-informed care and adverse childhood experiences. It's kind of like, well, what does that mean for our policies? And so there are some of you that will be focused on moving forward on organizational leadership, and some that are more focused on, you know, work with individuals. And so there's a role for talking about epigenetics, talking about brain development, neuroscience. All of that matters at all levels of social work practice. So to reiterate from last week, the discussion about epigenetics today is kind of nestled within this this near science understanding of human development, which really is kind of this perspective that we can talk about a lot of different things by just looking at these four different categories. And we'll touch a little bit on ACEs today, but we'll focus mostly on epigenetics. And we talked about resilience last week. So a little bit on the Human Genome Project. I think Dr. Combs-Orme touched on this, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on this. But this was, you know, the big goal. You know, we thought we were going to know everything. We thought that, you know, once we, you know, mapped all our genes, we were going to have cures for cancer, and, you know why people did what they did, and understood all kinds of, you know, genetic potential. But all it really did was create this whole new field and this awareness that genes are only part of the equation. And we really wound up with more questions than we had answers. And it was more about, what we did not learn versus what we actually learned. So, so epigenesis has actually become more important in the field of genetics than understanding human health and behavior. Okay, for time's sake, I'm going to skip this, but I will ask you very quickly, does anybody know what all of these places have in common? Anybody? Bueller?
Didn't they all have, events that happened that described how epigenetics work, essentially?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
They did. And they also have had some level of research around that. We had the Dutch hunger winter. We had World War II. We had Calyx was highly featured in the Ghosts in Their Genes video from Sweden. In New York, there was the study with pregnant moms during 9/11, and in North Carolina, there's a lot of epigenetics research at Duke University, which we'll focus on here in a little bit. Because you've already had this other lecture, I don't want to spend a huge amount of time. I think we can talk during our office hours if you'd like about some of the kind of details around gene expression. You've read a lot about it. You've seen a lot of videos. But the overall point here is that, it's not necessarily about the genes that you have. It's about how those genes are expressed. And the whole field of epigenetics is looking at how does the environment serve to silence some genes and turn some genes on so that they actually become part of our phenotype. So, every cell in your body has the same DNA. And what's really fascinating is that the process of epigenetics doesn't actually change our DNA. We still have the same DNA as we do when we're born. It's just whatever we are coming into contact with within the environment actually changes how that DNA essentially functions and how it serves to code for those proteins and actually have the help express those genes. So I just kind of said that. So I just sort of said that too. So epigenetics, it's really this, epi is the root of that. Epi means on top of, like they talked about in the Ghosts in Your Genes video. And it's like, like we think about our skin, that's our epidermis, so you can think about, we have our genome, but it's, what's going on top of that that's actually helping to influence the way that those different genes within our genome are expressed. So many genes require specific environmental circumstances in order to be expressed, and many genes are never expressed. We could have a gene that would predispose us to develop cancer, but if it's never turned on because of other factors or other, environmental factors, new diet, nutrition, exercise, that attitude, meditation, who knows, because of those environmental pieces, that gene could never get expressed. So it's kind of this is where I like to wave my yellow flag of caution around things like genetic testing. I know that some of you may have done that or know somebody who has done that. It's definitely becoming like the new thing that people want to do because they really want individualized healthcare. And I think unless you are really working with an experienced and knowledgeable geneticist, that, it could be kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole because just because you have the gene doesn't mean that that's going to be expressed. It may be good information for you to have to know that you might have a certain, particular risk, but there's still so many genes that we don't even really understand what they do. So That's actually a continuously evolving field. So just something to be a little cautious about. Like I've been saying, it isn't about the genes that you have, it's about the genes that are expressed. So there are three primary ways, at least that we know now, that make up sort of this whole epigenetic process. So when we talk about gene expression, we can look at that through the process of DNA methylation, which is adding, methyl groups to the different DNA base pairs. Histone modification, which includes, chromatin remodeling, and, that kind of, helps. It's like those little strings that kind of wind around the histones and can kind of tighten or loosen. And so they allowed, proteins to code or to not code. So that can affect what genes are expressed. And then these little tiny micro, RNA processes. So the video that I have for this, I have posted. So I can play that again, but I think because I'm going to skip it because I think everybody has probably watched it by now, but that's the Mr. Anderson video that really explains all three of these in great detail. So I think if you still have some questions, maybe watch the video again. But I think really this is sort of the universe of what I would expect you all to know as it relates to how genes are expressed. This is covered somewhat in the quiz, not to a huge degree and not to great detail. So I think just if you've watched the video and kind of read the stuff, I think you'll be fine. But also the important thing here, which is why so much more of our focus is on the CTEs, is how are you going to apply this information? How are you going to critically think about this and talk about the implications of this new information, with your clients? I'm not training you all to be neuroscientists. I don't expect you to know every last little detail of everything. However, every one of you is different, and some of you will get super excited about this information and really want to dive in, and I certainly encourage you to do that. But this is pretty much the baseline of understanding that I would expect. So there are some things that we know that affect gene expression, things like alcohol during pregnancy, other toxic chemicals, pesticides, prescription medications. We certainly wonder about babies who are born drug dependent, like those with neonatal abstinence syndrome. I would certainly imagine that there's a lot of epigenetic triggers that were happening with that. Stress hormones, that is huge. Stress, we will spend a lot of time in a couple of weeks in the stress and trauma unit talking about stress. Stress is a big deal and is pretty much the common denominator in, I think, all of our kind of the top things that kill people prematurely, aside from things like accidents, but, cancer, heart disease, diabetes. There's a role of stress in all of this because stress is a physiological event. It's a physiological phenomenon, and it does things like release hormones that pretty much, especially in utero, are going to have a huge impact on our development and ultimately our behavior. If we're awash in cortisol, our life is going to look very different than if it's not. So there's a lot to be said. So I won't spend a huge amount of time on that because we have a whole unit on that. But that's a big one to remember. Obesity, this is an example of, and again, Dr. Combs-Orm talked about this, so I don't want to spend a huge amount of time, but just know that that obesity is one of those places where, we can showcase, because there's actually a lot of concrete epigenetic research around how obesity works, and especially all of those that research around the mice that Mr. Anderson talked about, that were talked about in the Ghost in Our Genes video. Those agouti mice, those mice that they breed and they become yellow. It's like the yellow ones are sort of the fatter ones. That's helping to expand our understanding about how all of this how all of this works. So there's so many different pieces to the puzzle when you look at what causes obesity, and this is just one piece of the puzzle here. And Dr. Randy Girdle is somebody who you have read about, and he's at Duke University, and he's one of those people who worked on the research with mice. And so when he talks about here the birth of more yellow offspring, those are those agouti mice that you've talked about. And this is just kind of one example. You know, there's a whole list of epigenetics research. This is just like one little tiny thing I wanted to highlight for you all. So he's specifically talking about how, as you can see here, we looked at pollution. So we're saying here pollution is just one of these many, many causes of obesity, and how one of the ways that we're seeing that is that, as Dr. Girdle said, we have recently demonstrated that exposure of pregnant mice to bisphenol A, that's BPA. So a lot of you may have seen some of those like water bottles that say, you know, BPA free, and those plastics, you know, we know it's a carcinogen basically. It results in the birth of more yellow offspring, which are the mice that become obese and have a higher incidence of diabetes and cancer as adults. Thus, there could be a connection between the increase in plastics in our environment and the rising incidence of obesity in humans. So that's a big deal. But he also says that, however, such an association will not be able to be demonstrated unequivocally until the expression and function of genes involved in human obesity are shown to be altered by BPA. So basically he's saying, this is what we see in mice. We can think about it in terms of applying this to humans, but we don't know it definitively until we actually have been able to map and show more of how, what are the specific genes that are impacted by obesity, and how are those genes altered by, shown to be altered by the presence of BPA in that person's environment. So this is kind of that disclaimer of, we're still learning. This is an evolving field and we're still learning. So there's, again, a lot to be said. Some other key pieces I think that are really relevant to social work are the idea that there are different periods of time in a person's life in their developmental process where they are more susceptible to epigenetic changes. This does not mean that this is the only time that people are susceptible to change. It's just the most susceptible times. And this will also translate to our discussion around brain development. But as it relates to epigenetic changes specifically, those 3 times are the early stage of embryonic stem cell development, early childhood, and puberty. So those are those kind of 3 most critical periods, and it's the exact same time, and it crosswalks right over to brain development as well. So once established, those effects can remain throughout life and can be passed on to future generations, which is why epigenetics is such a critical thing for us to understand, is because this is not just about what we're doing now. It is something that we are going to pass down to our children, and to our grandchildren, and to our grandchildren. So it's a really big deal, but it's also something that's just not entirely understood. We really are at the we are pretty much in the infancy phases, maybe early childhood phase of epigenetic research. I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions before I kind of jump into fetal programming? Anything on this? Trying to balance kind of completely repeating everything that you've heard so far. Okay. Fetal programming is a critical thing for us to focus on as social workers. This is pretty much the general idea that during development, the embryo and the fetus pretty much gets told and programmed for to be as prepared as possible for the environment in which they are going to be born. So that resetting, or basically that programming, what that looks like, it can endure into adulthood and affect the following generation, thus producing a transgenerational non-genetic disorder. So it's not in our actual genes, it's in how our genes are expressed. So some examples of that are cancer, diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. So again, we're not changing, epigenetics is not changing the DNA, it's passing on this experience without changing the DNA. So it's basically nature's way of saying, you know, life is really hard. We don't have access to a lot of food. There's a lot of violence. I'm under a lot of stress. And you need to be prepared for that, little baby. You know, you need to be prepared to adapt and function and still be healthy and grow and thrive, even though you don't have access to a lot of nutrients or maybe a wide variety of nutrients, which is what the famine studies have shown us. There's some possible examples around violence and reactivity, which is very, very interesting. And I don't have much more to say about it, except to say that it's helping us to understand that whereas before we may have thought that someone was, you know, born violent or born with a propensity toward violence, but it also can be understood. It's sort of helping to shift our thinking that it can be understood as someone who is born with a propensity or is actually born prepared to deal with violent and threatening stimuli. Do you see how that's kind of a real shift? That it's not saying that this person is born, you know, violent or bad. It's this person is born to respond and react to a violent environment in a way that outwardly looks like violence, but in reality may be, you know, a child. Think about all the disorders names are escaping me right now. But when children are acting out and are, you know, fighting in school, kicking, not being able to settle down, those people who kind of, you know, their baselines are sort of up here, so they're like reacting really quickly to stressful stimuli. We can start to understand, or at least, you know, there's research that's kind of continuing to evolve that may help us to understand that those kids are really just, they're wired to fight, essentially. They're because they're being responsive. It's not that they are, you know, inherently violent or something like that. Because if they were placed into an environment that wasn't violent, they probably wouldn't be violent themselves. Okay, somehow I lost my chat box. Okay, I'm trying to find it. Ah, here we go. Okay. Yes, thank you, ODD. Perfect example. Having brain fog. Yes. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so moving along. This is one of my favorite slides of all time. Thinking about, you know, a lot of times people think that babies can't be stressed. They think that they don't, people think that they don't understand what is going on around them just because they're nonverbal, and you know, nothing could be further from the truth. They're pretty much absorbing everything. They're just little sponges. And so all of these things here that you see are, you know, can be factors and really impact a baby from a developmental standpoint and from an epigenetic standpoint as well. Won't spend a whole lot of time on this. Just a reminder that there are, you know, you can think about that stressed baby. You can think about the things like poor maternal nutrition during gestation, alcohol in utero, nicotine in breast milk. These are things that are going to be affecting that baby, you know, in kind of just within this one generation. So what we can see epigenetically as we look through this and these other, boxes are things like, did grandmother smoke during this baby's mother's pregnancy? Did the mother have poor nutrition when the mom was a fetus? So that would be talking about grandmother's access to nutrition. Generations of oppression and deprivation. This is absolutely huge. And the research around the impact of racism, intergenerational poverty, oppression related to, outward characteristics like race or sex. These are things that we are starting to understand more as having an impact on our development and having an impact, even being things like drivers for adverse childhood experiences. So we'll talk more about the brain next week. But some things that are really relevant to social work are things like, brain imaging has allowed us to connect the specific deficits in poor environments to effects on specific parts of the brain. And we're going to talk more about that next week, but I did want to highlight that poverty. It's important to understand poverty is not just being about low income or socioeconomic status. It's about things like higher levels of stress, higher caregiver strain, fewer material resources and stimulating experiences, which is absolutely critical for brain development in early childhood, and less nurturing during childhood period, which is the most critical time. So things that are passed down culturally, things that are passed down from kind of generation to generation. How many times have we heard like, well, I used a switch because my mom used a switch on me, or, things like that, that people are just kind of doing what they learned and not really understanding that these can have huge negative impacts on development. And some of these are much more associated with poverty, and poverty is not just about money. There's so many kind of correlates to this that can impact a child's development. It's really important, especially when you think about vulnerable populations, many of whom are living in poverty or who come from impoverished backgrounds. So this is something I wanted to jump to and make sure that I had time to chat about before we jump to our presentations. And when we talk about things like oppression and discrimination, there is some specific research you're going to read. This is specifically from Geronimus, and there is his article is published or is available under the stress unit. But just to give you a little teaser, because I think it's really relevant to the epigenetic conversation too, is when we talk about how racism or oppression can impact a person at a physiological level. There is a research and theories that are called MEES, so MEES, which is mundane extreme environmental stress, which is essentially these low level and constant environmental events. So these are things outside of us. These are not things inside of us, but they impact us. The environment is impacting us. And the research is specifically around African Americans, and it shows that African Americans, because of this kind of low-level constant stress that they are exposed to within the United States, they have higher, on average, higher levels of blood pressure, higher rates of heart disease, and more prematurity. So babies who are born premature are, that happens at a higher rate, and there are more low birth weight infants. And those two aspects of those two indicators for babies are really, really important when you think about long-term development over time. Okay, so are there any questions about this? We'll talk about this more, and some of it's kind of expanded on a little bit more in the other slide deck, but we'll talk about this more under the stress unit as well. But it's really important when we talk about epigenetics too. just jump in if you have any questions. I'm going to skip this. I do invite you to read it. It's just kind of a state of the field where we are with epigenetics. And there are some implications for kind of research and kind of where we are. I definitely think it's important that anytime the conversation of epigenetics comes up, that we think about ethical implications, especially as social workers. And there are a lot of considerations, and I think as the field moves forward, it's going to be important for all of you wherever you are, because y'all are all over the country and internationally in some cases, and so this could look very different depending on policies. I mean, even if you look at the difference between Canadian policies related to human services and American policies related to human services, they're night and day. They are night and day. And so, what are things like, are we ethically obligated to criminalize the epigenetic transmission of disease or other conditions that negatively impact individuals or society? In Tennessee, we tried to criminalize mothers for having babies that were born drug dependent with, NAS, with neonatal abstinence syndrome. That law fortunately went off the books last year or year before, but it was on the books for 2 years, and we were actually, criminally charging women who had babies. And so when you think about it, that's just kind of one example. And so what are all of these other things when you think about the vast scope of our epigenome? And when you think about, as a grandmother who smoked, think about if you're that grandmother right now. So who's to say, once people have a broader understanding and once we have more research, who's to say where all of these things are going to go from a policy standpoint, a political standpoint. So it's really important to kind of keep your eyes and ears open for that as we move forward. Okay, I'm going to touch on ACEs, and then we'll jump right into our presentations. I wanted to just introduce this a little bit. Again, we're going to spend a lot more time under the stress and trauma unit on this, but there's a huge piece here for understanding ACEs or understanding epigenetics when we're looking at ACEs too. Yes, the law was absolutely awful. Totally agree. It made me so mad. I'm so glad it went away. Thank you for saying that. So some of those this is, for those of you who have not seen that, I wish I could do a show of hands to see. Maybe you can just throw your hand up or something in the chat function. If you have ever heard of adverse childhood experiences, I'm really curious how many of you all are familiar with this. It is a big deal that we will talk about. Great. Thank you for raising your hand. We will talk more about this, but I wanted to go ahead and introduce it now. There is a whole video on an overview of ACEs, but essentially it's pretty much, did you have some kind of adverse event before the age of 18? And what they have found is that your ACE score which is either between 0 or 10. So everybody has an ACE score. But the more ACEs that you have, so the higher ACE score, so especially above 4, that's kind of the cutoff where the risk really starts to increase. The higher your ACE score, the higher your risk for all kinds of things, including early death. If you have an ACE score of 6 or above, you are at risk of a shortened lifespan by 20 years. And that is because you have this kind of building that ACEs becomes the precursor for all of these things that are sort of this kind of cumulative risk, these things that just start to kind of compound and add up and kind of lead to one thing and lead to another thing. And if you can think about, that if you kind of start out with adverse childhood experiences, so things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, separation of a caregiver, a parent who is jailed, a parent who is has mental illness or substance abuse, if you were neglected, there are a number of different ACEs, but the higher the ACEs, the higher your risk of things like disrupted neurodevelopment. So that means your brain is not developing as positively as it could, as kind of meeting as much of its potential as if you didn't have those ACEs. And having that disrupted neurodevelopment can lead to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. And you're going to kind of see this as the child ages. And that impairment can then lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors. So what's an example of a health risk behavior? There's kind of an obvious one. That's an ACE in and of itself. Is drug and alcohol abuse. We typically abuse drugs and alcohol to feel good or feel better because we don't like the way our life looks, or we just, kind of reality is just too much. And so oftentimes these things just build on each other. And all throughout this whole process that Dr. Anda, who's one of the co-PIs on the ACEs study, helped us to understand there's these epigenetic mechanisms that can start to play. So you've got, negative things happening, chaotic home environment. There's, epigenetic triggers happening. You get older, you adopt these health risk behaviors. Then maybe you get pregnant while you're self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. Maybe, something's happening with that baby. There's all of these things that happen. So long-term use of, or long-term adoption of health risk behaviors can then lead to disease, disability, and social problems, which then in turn can lead to early death. So it's this kind of cycle that helps us understand. And then, on down the right side, you see this intergenerational transmission. So you've got these, the kids start out with ACEs, they grow up to then give their kids ACEs. I worked on a grant in the past that specifically looked at that, and having the parents understand their own ACE score wound up therapeutically being a major turning point for their work in understanding how to prevent those same risk factors for their own children. So there's a number of different implications for this. I could talk about this a lot, and I do, but I'm gonna jump through and end here around there are a lot of current and potential clinical prevention and even policy related applications within just human services, the broad field of human services. So social workers, there's kind of infinite potential here for how you can see this playing out. Yes, Amber, that is really important. I would love to talk to you offline about that. I think making sure that the people who are talking about that are really, highly trained and sensitive, and helping people understand about, how are you using this information? What is this information for? Because it's potentially really, triggering. It could be very triggering. There's kind of a big trigger warning when we get to the whole trauma unit around this. Even understanding our own ACE score is important as social workers, but it also can kind of be triggering just for ourselves. So think about it when you're talking about that with your clients. So, but looking at, ACEs, but also epigenetics in general, there's implications for when we're working with clients that are related to diet, nutrition, and exercise, exposure to toxic substances, drug and alcohol use, stress, like I talked about, poverty and racism and discrimination. There are therapeutic interventions that you may look at, and even there's starting to be epigenetic prescription drugs. So they kind of talked about that in the video a little bit, and there's an article on that as well. So there are different potential aspects that we can think about integrating this. So I have talked way too long, so I'm gonna exit this, and I would love to jump right into we have 3 groups that are going to present this evening, do an informal 5 to 10 minute presentation. So can I go ahead? Are there any, are there any questions before we jump into the presentation? Okay. Okay. So can I go ahead and ask the first group, Amber, Stephanie, Elena, and Ashley? Y'all want to go ahead and jump in?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, I'll go first. When adopting a child from parents who have a history of substance abuse and criminal backgrounds, it is natural to consider possible genetic components to these behaviors as they relate to your son. There is no definitive knowledge, yet recent research does provide hopeful ideas about genetic information your son received from his biological parents. Historically, researchers focused on genetics being a sole factor in passing biological information. Current studies, however, highlight the important role of the social environment in addition to DNA when determining specific expressed traits of individuals. The best way to review a possible predisposition to substance abuse or criminal behavior is by considering the role of epigenetics. Epigenetics is essentially communication of information to new cells, which dictates how genetic traits are expressed or suppressed in individuals. Social conditions like being raised in a nurturing environment, having proper nutrition, protection from toxic chemicals, and regular exercise all have notable effect on the likelihood of developing diseases. The sum of present research suggests children's resiliency ranges amongst those who have faced similar adverse backgrounds. Specific variations in behavioral, psychological, and genetic components affect which genes activate or turn on to express traits, both positive and negative. By providing a supportive environment for this child, you have the opportunity to significantly alter the genetic information on which expresses itself in your son and undoubtedly improve the quality of his overall life.
Wow. Okay, awesome. Was that your CTE, or was that your group's like kind of collective CTE?
That was my CTE. We were all sort of not exactly clear on how to do it. So that was, I think we're all just going to sort of read ours unless you have a different suggestion.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that's where we're at now. So we can talk about it moving forward.
Okay.
Okay, so who wants to go next?
Well, this is Stephanie. I was under the impression that we were going to split it up a little bit, like to talk about different parts of it. So the part that I chose to talk about it was like to analyze the question. I can talk from like personal experience. My friend and coworker adopted or was in the process of adopting 3 children. And these 3 children were exposed to drug abuse and things from their parents. Their parents were both incarcerated, so they lost their children, and the children were put up for adoption. So my friend and her husband had a lot of questions and concerns about adopting these children. So they fostered them at first just to kind of test the waters to see if this is what they wanted to do. And because the children were exposed to meth and other things like that, they had to go to therapy. They've had occupational kind of therapies. They had speech therapies. They were delayed in many places, in many areas. I believe the oldest one, she's 4. She's the one that had the most impact on her. She has a lot of emotional issues, like she doesn't trust anyone. And the other 2, one was 10 months. The other one was, I think, 2 years old. They adjusted well. They've turned around. They called them mommy and daddy, and so they've adjusted well. But the older one is the one that really had the issues, and they're still working with her. So I don't know. I go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that kind of illustrates some of those neurodevelopmental issues that were kind of represented on that ACEs pyramid too.
Yes. So anyway, I can see the effects of the environment, especially on the 2 younger ones. I really have good feelings about the older one. I feel like she will come around, but I can see the effects. Epigenetics is like alive and active right there in that whole group, that whole situation.
Okay, great. Amber and Ashley?
I'll go next. I guess I was supposed to do the concept and vocabulary part of it. And I feel like that when if we are to talk to some foster parents about this, that it's important to explain to them the part where we talk about how the violence and addiction and depression are not inherited. They're not like conditions and diseases aren't necessarily predetermined in children before they're born. I feel like that's a very important part that we would need to explain to them, because I know if you don't research it, of course, it's going to be hard to understand. And it's scary too when, you have that child right in front of you. Also, I think that we would explain the fetal programming. I think that would be a good thing to explain to the parents about how the child, even in when they're a fetus, that they're still attentive and they understand the things going on around them, and their whole self is formed around that. And I just kind of want to touch on what Stephanie said just a little bit about how when I was doing research, and the best way to try to prevent those, the depression, substance abuse, and violence in those children is just nurturing parenting. And I personally can say that worked for me because I was adopted when I was young, and I come from a home where my parents were that had substance abuse problems and violence, and my adoptive parents have been more than supportive, and they're great parents, and I'd like to think that I came out pretty good. So it's nice to I kind of learned about myself, in this. So
wow. It's crazy when the CTEs like hit so close to home. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think that just also reinforces that these are, these are real people that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. Real issues, whether they deal with ourselves or whether they are, relate to the clients that we're going to deal with. So, okay, last one, and we got to kind of keep it moving.
Okay, I was responsible for the questions. So my first question is, how would you address the concern? How would my classmates address some of the concerns of the foster parents? Like, I want to hear from you guys.
Good question. All right. Students.
Anybody want to speak up?
Can you repeat your question?
Repeat it?
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. How would you guys address the concerns of the foster parents?
So kind of what are some of the solutions when you think about, okay, here's all this information. How would we actually, work towards combating any kind of genetic risk?
I think it would be helpful to kind of create, the child is really young, so a behavior plan may not be the best, but it's something that you can definitely give a guidelines to. And even maybe recommending doing just some play therapy, things that are going to develop connection and support healthy attachment. I think talking about that with the parents and letting them know that's something that we can go into it already doing, and we can have it set up for however long you think you need it, and then whenever they feel comfortable and know that the child's not going to turn into a drug dealer and murder them, then I would think that they could kind of taper off.
I think an important thing too, and the group that I've been working with discussed this, when you're explaining things, some people will understand the genetic background of it, but I think breaking it down and explaining in smaller words and, a better understanding how we would understand it will be important too. You don't want to come at them with a lot of big words and, well, this is their DNA and this is, how this works. And I think that could just be more confusing than anything.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. We had a group in this afternoon who had decided to introduce this topic as if the class was all adoptive parents and they were doing a training. And so they actually broke down this whole conversation, kind of using the metaphor that I provided and looked at, looking at the resiliency scale and things like that. And it was really fascinating, but I think it was exactly to your point of, kind of breaking it down, it's like it's not just good enough for us to understand this. We have to be able to translate that and make that information accessible to people from all different backgrounds and languages and reading levels and all that kind of stuff. So great point. Okay, thank y'all for that. I'm going to jump into Group B. So Madison, Ashley, Malia, and Mary. Y'all ready to rock and roll?
Yeah, I think I'll begin, and we're not going to do it or unless Ashley might want to do it like read the CTE, but I'm going to discuss kind of like a personal aspect on it and then kind of spin off from there. But my parents and family we were a foster family for about 8 years, and we had different children come into our home, and then we got a sibling group of 3. The 2 older ones, their father was deceased. They all 3 had the same mother. And the younger one, his father was just unavailable and was not really present in his life. So we had them in foster care for 3 years. And foster care, they were ages 6, 10, and 12. And they all did pretty well, just regular behavior issues. And then at 9, 12, and 14, we decided to adopt them. And so now they are 14, 18, and 20. And things have really spiraled down. The 20-year-old, he went to college his first year at University of Memphis and started making bad decisions. And left school and came back home and didn't want to live by mom and dad's rules. So he has left the home, and throughout high school, he started using drugs here and there. And then my sister recently, she turned 18, and she left us as well and is living with her 16-year-old boyfriend and making poor decisions. And then the 14-year-old, he is still with my parents and doing pretty well. But I look at it as the epigenetics, if they're exposed to different things, then those genes are going to be triggered. And I feel like that's kind of how it has happened with my siblings that we have adopted. Of course, my parents did not expose them to drugs or alcohol, but they were pre-exposed. And it's kind of like they already had it in them. And so whenever my brother got the first taste of alcohol and started using drugs, it went downhill from there. And then I think about it as a perspective of, this is kind of totally opposite, but when they lived with their mother, they did not play sports. They weren't involved in church. They were not involved in the community, different things that the community offers. And every one of those children have been athletes. They've played multiple sports and have excelled in those sports. And it's just interesting to look at, had they not been exposed to those things, would they have ever become an athlete? And it's just very interesting to me.
Okay. Yes, I think those are all really good examples. Who wants to jump in next?
I think it's just Ashley and I. I don't know if anybody else is in.
Oh, okay. Okay, Ashley. Oh, you're having mic issues. That happens sometimes. You may have to just move on. I don't know what to tell you. Oh, there's somebody's mic is on. Somebody's dog. Alex's dog. Okay. Well, Ashley, I guess if your mic is not working, we may just have to jump on to the next group. So Malia and Mary aren't on. You may want to call, Ashley, you may want to call OIT tomorrow and just see if they can help you. I'm really not the greatest person with that. I apologize. So I just know I've been on some Zooms and that's happened before. So, but I don't know how to fix it. Okay. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so group C, y'all want to jump in?
Yes, I'm in group C.
Okay, sorry, Shandy, just one thing. Ashley, I hate for you to be prepared and not be able to participate. So if you want to go ahead and type something while group C is talking, then that's, if you feel up to that, then that sounds great.
Okay, so we broke ours up in to sections, and so we're each addressing the question just in different sections. Okay. But while DNA contributes to the genotype of an individual, epigenetic research has found that the phenotype or physical expression of genes is highly dependent on a person's gene interaction with the environment. Epigenetics is the primary predictor of behavioral outcomes. As shown in epigenetics, genes can be silenced and even activated based on a person's environment and experience. This happens through methylation and histone modification. Promotive and protective factors can help a child develop and exercise resilience. Genes may create susceptibility, but based on epigenetics, genes may not be expressed depending on environmental influence. For example, nurturing parenting is key in children as they are most malleable in infancy and childhood, meaning their genes are most malleable in infancy and childhood. Also, I would note that soothing has been proven to regulate stress response system. So that would be something you would want to include in your parenting. And other determinants are things like diet, toxin exposure, and social environment. Some of the key environmental influences are social support, resources, stability, like routines, especially having mealtime together, and then safety. These all highly affect gene expression. So the likelihood of repeating behaviors is based on how their genes respond to the environment. And for example, a way to understand it is to see our genome as like clay and our environment as a container. And so we're in our environment. So the clay is in a container, and based on whatever shape the container looks like, that's how the clay is going to be shaped or influenced. And so I guess the form taken based on the container is going to be your phenotype or your how your genes are going to be expressed. And then now Chelsea is going to talk more to you guys about temperament and long-term personality and how that will develop.
Hey guys, I focused on the reading based on temperament and how that shapes environment. So when during fetal programming, that's going to shape the temperament that a child has, like whether you're shy or more introverted, and that together with the environment will create the personality. Temperament can be seen in a newborn because it is in utero, that is created based on the effects of the environment when the mother is pregnant. But going back to the metaphor of the clay, the parents are like the potter. So if the foster parents or the adoptive parents were to shape the clay and take time with it, it's going to be have more effect on what the child is like long term. Kind of like someone can be introverted but still enjoy people and not be shy or hesitant or timid around people. Just because you prefer alone time doesn't mean you don't enjoy other people. So environment plays the strongest role in dictating how a person's personality is going to be displayed. And then I am going to turn it over to Brittany to discuss methylation.
Okay, so to talk about methylation, I'm kind of touching on what Chelsea said about fetal programming. Since the child, had, as we said, or you said during our discussion about, being reactive to because of violence, they're kind of thinking that. That also can say, one of our articles mentioned that they're also more susceptible to positive environments. So that's a plus that, we could mention to the parents. And then methylation, Waters talked about that a defective methylation pattern could possibly be reestablished and create a healthy pattern, and that pattern can actually follow you from infancy to childhood and all the way into adulthood, and they believe it has lasting effects. So it's important to let the parents know that, yes, the child may be predisposed to that, but that's not their destiny, like that one article said. It doesn't mean that they're going to be that way, and you can explain through methylation that they can change and that you can kind of reprogram them. I hate saying reprogram their kids, but you can kind of help them and get away from that through methylation and parenting, as we've talked about, nutrition. And so I'm going to pass it on to Jessica, who's going to sum us up and talk about polymorphism.
Okay, guys. Just going to draw a conclusion here and wrap up what they've already said. And I know you're like me, your brain is just trying to take in all of this anyway. So I'm going to be a little less formal because I like how some of you were expressing your personal stories and stuff. I don't have a personal story, but I really liked the polymorphism video and how it talked about the chance that certain traits may not have been passed along the same. Liked how it had the twins, and the older they got, the more you could see the change in one versus the other one. I thought it was interesting. And I work in a school system with children, so we've kind of, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this, but we just kind of take on, we obviously don't deal with foster parents or anything like that, but they are having behavioral issues or something's going on. Our first question is not what's wrong with you. It's usually what's happened or, what's going on, because it's normally environment. And that, as social workers, we've all been talking about, that's pretty much everything we focus on. Like I said, I'm just going to wrap it up with some of the other things we had talked about, the daily functions from ghosting your genes, how as the twins got older, some of the things changed, and then also the older set of twins, the women, how one of them developed cancer. Epigenetic is just, excuse me, it is all the same DNA, it's just the expression of the genes. And I have one more thing I wanted to say here that I read in this last article here. It was just saying in summary that the data reviewed illustrated the potential of the genetic approach and the aspects of the emotional reactivity and regulation. So I just, out of everything, I guess the ghost in our genes was probably my favorite part. So I'm glad that I got to wrap it up with that.
Good. Well done. I love how y'all were able to kind of work together and kind of paint a really good picture. Did you have any questions for the your students? Ashley, I think you had a question, so I want to jump back. Thank you so much. You wrote some awesome stuff for us to kind of download and consider. And Ashley's question was, does anyone have a personal example of something inherited that was then impacted, whether expressed or silenced, which might be a little hard to figure out. We don't really necessarily know what we have that's not expressed, that you're willing to share? That's a very interesting question. Would anyone like to think about that, ponder that for a second and jump in there?
I'll say something. So hopefully I'm on the right track here with what she was asking as our question. But something that's impacted me is that my grandmother tore both of her ACLs, my mother tore both of her ACLs, and now I tore both of my ACLs. And so I have like a lot of these like knee problems that are not, I guess, surprising because my grandmother went through it and then my mother and now me. But that's just something that I inherited that now I'm dealing with. And as I'm getting these surgeries and kind of changing the way that I live and I work because of my knees, I'm wondering if that potentially in the future will change how my genetics get passed on, and that type of thing. So that's my little bit there.
I know. Phenotype is fascinating, right? I mean, that's just so interesting, and it makes you wonder, well, what is it related? Is it environment, or is it nutrition, or it's some level of genetics, or something, like something's going on, for you guys? Because that's also that's not like a normal everyday type of, I broke my elbow or something, I mean, that's like a very serious thing. I'm really sorry that y'all have had to go through that. I know people have had that surgery. It's really intense. So glad you're still able to do all this despite those issues.
Yeah, hanging on.
All right. So one last thing about the last group that spoke, and somebody mentioned it here too. I think Candace said a cool metaphor about the clay is I hadn't heard that metaphor before. I think that's a really cool thing. I think one of you said that the adoptive parents were like you didn't say clay makers, you said something else. The potters, yes. And that they're actually helping to be able to form whatever that container is that clay is going into, or that, however they're helping to kind of shape that clay. That's a really interesting metaphor. And I think, it's kind of why I posted those metaphors before, looking at the resilience scale and those type of things. And we'll look at the brain architecture explanatory metaphor. If you have not downloaded those, they're under the CTEs module. They can be really helpful to y'all in this discussion, and especially with brains, there's so many videos that I will show you about brain architecture, and building the brain is like building a house. You have to have a strong foundation and all of that kind of stuff. And it's so important to be able to find some kind of translatable information that you can help explain these really big concepts to people from all different sectors and walks of life and educational backgrounds and things like that. So I appreciate your effort to go out there and experiment with and find a new metaphor. I think that's really cool. Well, are there any last comments or questions about from any of the teachers today? Okay, well, thank you all very much for your presentations. I encourage all of the future groups to make sure that you, work together to come up with something. This is your opportunity to teach the class from your perspective. Again, some of the best feedback that I've had in these courses are when we're able to learn from each other, not just me. Y'all teach me every single day. So, I certainly know that you can learn from each other. And just some tips for getting together with your groups. We still, again, have 3 more weeks of this. Some people have been successful at setting up groups on Canvas. You can go into the people section and set up a group and maybe communicate that way. Make sure that you have everybody's email and that you're participating. If for some reason you know that you're going to miss the Zoom section because you have to work or something's going on, please make sure you're communicating with your peers via email and at least contributing that way so that you can have your voice heard and participate in the teaching opportunity as well. Remember the see one, do one, teach one. This is the teach one. Okay, so we are kind of have perfect time running up against our the close of our session. So before we jump into office hours, are there any other questions from any of y'all for me about any of the content from this week or for next week? Feel free to raise your hand or drop something in the chat or just jump in there. If you aren't in Nashville, I appreciate your support of the Nashville Predators. We've never been to the Stanley Cup before. It's complete madness in here. This week we have the CMAs here too and Bonnaroo. It's just crazy. It's really wild around here right now. So hope you all go. Oh, do you have a question? Let's see. So in the, do you have to have a question? So it's, I encourage you all in the outline that I provided in the introductory lecture where it talks about what's expected for the CTE presentations. It says that you can pose a question to the class, and that's really just to keep the discussion going. So I definitely, recommend that you think about at least one question would be good.
I have a question.
Sure.
And you may have already said this last week, and I'm sorry I didn't get the notification for Zoom. But our groups that we're in, is that the group we're going to be in for other assignments?
Yeah, and there really are no other assignments. So what I encourage is you only had to present one time. So since you were part of this week, you don't have to present any more in any future weeks. But I do, I know y'all are in different time zones in different states, so I know it can be really challenging to get together, but, at a minimum, you need to be, doing the quizzes and completing your CTEs individually each week. I recommend that you chat with your fellow folks, either via email or scheduling a Zoom or something. If you guys want to just get together in your same group, each week. I mean, it's just an added learning opportunity. It's kind of like you get out of this course what you put into it. But I certainly am respectful and sensitive to, I know that, y'all have lots of competing demands being online students. So that's why I didn't say everybody had to present every week or anything like that. So you just have to do it once. But if you want to get together for any other kind of group activities, that's totally your prerogative.
Okay, thank you.
Like, for example, in the Nashville class, like, we'll meet for just like 10 or 15 minutes each week in the group and be assigned to groups, but only like 2 groups present each week. But y'all don't really have the opportunity to do that online. So that's why I was like, I'm trying to kind of do what I can. I could, and y'all are welcome to give me feedback too. I could also build in some time where I could try to figure out how to do like breakout sessions and y'all could meet with your group like during this time. So we would just sort of pause the lecture and y'all could meet in your groups for 10 minutes and then maybe come back and we could do the presentation. So if y'all think that's a good idea, please shoot me an email. I just kind of thought it might be a little too complicated, and so I didn't build that in.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? No, Alicia, you're not missing anything. It's really just the 4 quizzes that you have make up your grade and then the potential extra credit. That's it. It's pretty simple. It is 1 credit hour. I know I'm asking y'all to read a lot and do a lot, but it's still just 1 credit hour. Any other questions? Okay, well, I appreciate your engagement and participation this evening. We will be here, same time, same bat station, I will always, like I said, post the Zoom link under the module for that week, and then I will post the recording Zoom under the Zoom link once it's recorded. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and I hope you all have a great evening, and I will be on as long as y'all are for office hours, but I won't record those questions.